Hi everyone, it's James here from TSR Jivey Talks Tech. Believe it or not, it will be 2 years this December that I moved into this, my Mark III home studio. And while it's pretty much finished on the inside, like a studio's ever really finished, it does still need quite a bit of work on the outside. However, I digress. I always wanted this space to be two things. One, I wanted it to be as up-to-date and forward-thinking as possible, with the inclusion of built-in cameras for live streaming and extra cabling for whatever the next big thing in audio or video turned out to be. And two, I wanted it to be a traditional style recording studio where the old ways were appreciated and understood. And to that end, I have the analog console, which I love working on, and I have plenty of real instruments, guitars, drums, keyboards, amps, the sort of thing that I like to make music with. I love it when I have a group of players in here, all recording and playing at the same time. It's just the best feeling, but it is quite an old school approach. When I started designing this place, God, I've lost track of how many years ago now, I always planned to install an immersive monitoring system for Dolby Atmos. But with the runaway build costs, and didn't they run away, that particular aspect of the project was shelved. However, I did plan for a possible retrofit upgrade by including all the data, signal, and power needs that an immersive speaker installation might require. Well, I'm about to start on the first big upgrade of the new studio. And with a lot of help from some friends and industry partners, I'm going to install what has become known as an Atmos rig in the studio, and I'd love for you to join me on the journey. This project is going to be divided up into 4 main parts. This is part 1, which in turn will be divided up into smaller chunks, because nobody needs to sit through 2 hours of YouTube video, right? Part 1 is the why, how, where, and what of Dolby Atmos. I'm going to be speaking to and seeking advice from people like Nate Baglios from Cali Audio, who have agreed to sponsor the speakers for this adventure. I'm also going to be hitting up 2 friends who are already well and truly on their Atmos mixing journey. Steve Genck, who was staff engineer at Capitol Studios in Los Angeles, and was one of the first to really embrace Dolby Atmos for music mixing. And Matt Boudreau from the Working Class Audio podcast, who is not only a great mix engineer, but is also a great advocate and educator in all things Dolby Atmos. So let's start with Nate from Cali. I asked him about making the transition from a stereo mix picture to what was once called a surround mixing environment to what we now call immersive audio. And one small thing here, where I say Dolby Atmos, those from the other side of the pond say Atmos. Who's right? Let's not go there. So Nate Baglios from Cali.
So it's very much still catching on. Within music, I would say still 90+% of what we're doing is still in the stereo world. So in terms of how Cali is looking at Atmos and how Cali is looking at building products for Atmos, there are some things where we've got some sort of natural fits that make the things we do well work particularly well for Atmos. And one of those is the way that our speakers play in space. So both at Cali and all of us before we were at Cali working for other speaker brands, we have a really good understanding of what a speaker needs to do in a room. It's not just about on-axis frequency response. It's not just about on-axis neutrality. It's about neutrality within the room and what that means and what psychoacoustically you perceive as neutral when you're sitting in the listening position. That's really important for stereo speakers, but once you add 11 speakers plus to a room, that gets extremely important. And if your speakers aren't playing well spatially in the room, Atmos is not going to sound good. It's not going to translate. It's not going to be fun to work on. So we've got a natural advantage there already, is that we have put a lot of time and effort and research into how do our speakers play within a room? What does translation mean when the speaker is actually in a room, when a room is an acoustic part of how the speaker is performing? Beyond that, the big thing and it's sort of boring, is just mounting. The speakers need to go into all these different places within the room. They need to be, in many cases, wall mounted because there isn't room for speaker stands, or there's not floor space for speaker stands. And then obviously the overhead speakers need to be mounted to the ceiling. And if you as a speaker manufacturer aren't doing anything to support that, your speakers aren't going to be used for Atmos, period. People do not want to have to figure this out for themselves. So in the last few years, we've made a big push to make sure that all of our speakers are mountable and fairly easily mountable. There's some accessories that you buy from a third party, which is Triad Orbit, and you can get those up anywhere in a room.
So clearly Nate has dived, or is it doved, in hardcore here with the science. So I asked Matt what I really need to get started.
Clearly you're going to need some speakers, probably 12 of them to be exact, because the minimum setup that Dolby recommends is a 714 setup. So 7 speakers on this plane. The 1 is the sub or the LFE, and the 4 in that equation is the ceiling. So 7.1.4 is what you need to start with. Secondly, you're going to need something to control the volume of those speakers. So you're going to need some kind of, whether it's an Avid Matrix or a Grace M908 or one of the other things out there, maybe from UA or Apogee. There are many choices. So you're going to need something like that. And in an ideal world, you would get a controller that could handle time alignment of the speakers, as well as room correction to get your system to adhere to the Dolby curve, which we could talk about a little bit later. But that's essentially what you need to be thinking about. And I guess you need to make a decision about what DAW you're going to be using. I prefer Pro Tools for this because it seems to be tightly integrated with Dolby, and it works great. And there are many resources to help you in that. The controller is really up to personal taste. I mean, as are the speakers, of course, but the controller, everybody has different experiences. I came from a Grace M905 stereo controller, so going to a 908 seemed like the logical step. And with, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I will say that I have talked to people who have had trouble with some of the other interfaces out there and found that to be kind of the more challenging part of the whole learning curve. And for me, the Grace has been nothing but, solid. Not to give them a big ad here or anything, but it's quite simple and it does everything I need it to do. But like I say, to each his own, and your mileage may vary depending on what your needs are.
Okay, so having done some basic research and chatted to my friends in low places, I think I need a 7.1.4 Atmos setup. So that's 3 at the front, left, center, right, or left, center, right, left and right sides, left and right rears, and 4 height speakers. Oh, and a sub.
So huge caveat to your sub. What we're talking about when we talk about 7.1.4 is channel count. So that is channels of audio that your interface is outputting. That is not necessarily how many speakers are receiving that much audio. And the 7 and the 4 are pretty buttoned up. Those are going to 7 full range speakers and 4 full range speakers. The 1, and this is an important point to make, when we think about subwoofers for an Atmos system, we are thinking about the subwoofers as a system. So a system is getting a channel of audio, but frequently that is multiple subwoofers. And there's a further complication to that, which is a well-managed room typically is going to use both the .1 channel and a bass management channel. So, you could really split hairs and call it like 7.1.5.4 if you wanted to. But it's an important point to make. I'm gonna talk a lot about speakers in rooms and how speakers play in rooms and the importance of speaker positioning within the room. That is all. There is one set of math that works for the mid-range. There is one set of math that works for the low end. And so even if you have a truly full range speaker that can play down to 20 hertz, it might not want to go in the place in the room where it wants to sit for the mid-range picture to come together. The nice thing about bass managing your speakers is you can put the subwoofers where they want to go in the room to play well at the listening position. And the important thing about using multiple subs, if you have one source, which is your subwoofer, it is going to have room interactions that you need to find some way around. You can EQ it, you can ignore it, you can move your listening position around, but you're going to have those room interactions. As you start to add more subwoofers, you can cancel out those room interactions. So for example, if you have two subwoofers, one on each side of the room, your side-to-side mode you can cancel out. And now that's one dimension that you don't have to worry about. If you have four subwoofers, you can cancel out your back-to-front mode as well. By being able to do that, you have to use less EQ, which means your system is doing less work overall in terms of what it's processing. You have a more reliable sound at the listening position. So even though it's one channel of audio, we typically recommend that people use at least two subwoofers. And typically we also say with a Kali system, none of our full range speakers play below about 40 hertz. So we typically recommend you should bass manage those as well.
So what do I need? Because I've already got a great 2.1 rig with a really fruity sub. Do I really need to buy a full rig, or can I just add to what I have?
I have PMC speakers and a Kali sub. One of the reasons I chose the Kali sub is, value for your money in the sub area. It's brilliant. I think it's WS12, and I think it was like $600 or $700 or something like that. To me, I love PMC, which all my speakers are PMC in here except for the sub. I love PMC, but come on, $4,000 for a sub. I just couldn't do that. So I was like, Kali's got this sub. Actually, I think it was, once again, giving credit to Brendan Duffy. Brendan told me about the Kali sub. And I think my friend McKay Garner also told me about the Kali sub. And it does the job, and it does it at a great price. And that's all that mattered to me.
Yeah. So a question that comes up for us a lot too, and we'll go back to budget because that's really important. How much money do you want to spend? So I have my typical listening setup. It is baked. Can I just use this and augment it with Atmos? Can I put in a center channel and put in a bunch of other things? I would not recommend doing so unless you're able to stick with one manufacturer. So like if you have ATCs or keys or something really expensive for your left and right, we can't add a Kali as a center channel and add Kalis all around and call that an Atmos rig. We really do need a Kali left and right. We can mix and match within our offering, and I'm sure if you talk to other manufacturers, they would tell you similar things. But what's important is that you have phase coherence all around, and it's really important that you have phase coherence left, center to right. And the only way you're going to get that is using the same speaker, or using a speaker that is designed to be phase coherent. Like Adam makes a center channel that's phase coherent with a left and a right.
So at some point, we've had to talk dirty and talk numbers. So what's the difference between a $3,000 and a $30,000 system? And in Kali maths, which speakers should I be looking at?
We have offerings from about $3,000 for a full Atmos rig to about $30,000 for a full Atmos rig. So obviously a lot of room to play there. So I would want to know what your budget is, and then the important thing is what is your listening distance from the speakers that you're going to work with. This is something that both Dolby I mean, Dolby is really, really good about this. We have tried to be as good as Dolby is about this. So Dolby, with their DART, which is the Dolby Atmos room design tool, has a whole list of speakers that they typically recommend, and how far away you can be from those speakers in order to hit the Dolby reference level, which is 85 dB continuous with the ability of 20 dB peaks, which you can look at that and basically say 105 dB peak at the listening position is what you need in order to hit Dolby reference level. That's loud. Yeah, that's loud. And the 85 is the more important spec within that. But that is their spec. That's how they're speccing that. Now that's in room. So we specify, in our materials that we have in our specification documents, you can see that we have maximum listening distance, which is based on that Dolby spec. However, that's anechoic. So once you get those in a room, you can usually fudge that by about 4 dB. But the maximum distance that you can have from our speaker in anechoic space and still hit that reference level with an IN8, which is our loudest speaker, is about 4 meters, which is about 12 feet for Americans. So just a good thing to keep in mind. That's how much space you have to play with. And so if you want to be at a further listening distance, then Kali is probably not the right thing to be looking at. But if you're thinking about building your room, that gives you sort of the maximum boundary, how far away the speakers can be.
So from a driving point of view, if you like, what do I need to start my Atmos mixing journey?
The cause of mixing in stereo and Atmos came about because I was working with fellow engineer and former Working Class Audio guest, Chris Dugan. Chris works for Green Day. Chris approached me and said, HBO is going to start broadcasting the Real Time with Bill Maher show live in Atmos, and they need the Green Day theme song that is already out in the world. They need it remixed in Atmos. And so as we were working through that, he said, by the way, they're going to need a certain amount of deliverables. We need to be able to check the stereo down mix of the mix because not everybody's going to have an Atmos setup. And as we were working through that, I reconfigured my Grace controller to accommodate that. And then it, like a light bulb went off midway through the project. I thought, wait a minute, I could eliminate the need to do stereo mix, stems or stem creation, Atmos mix, and instead of creating two separate mix sessions of stereo and Atmos, I could merge these two things together. Therefore, saving time, having one Pro Tools session, also maybe adjusting the mix rate for the clients so they get two mixes at the same time, but I'm only doing one mix. And that's where all of this essentially emanated from.
So remembering that both Matt and I are hitters of things, also known as drummers, I asked him about the software side of the Dolby Atmos setup. Remember, of course, the golden rule here, people. Keep it simple. Or as I prefer, keep it simple, stupid.
I will tell you this as kind of a comment to your getting lost in some of the routing part of it, in that prior to Atmos, I barely scratched the surface of the Pro Tools IO page. And I've been using Pro Tools since 97 or 98. So with Atmos, it really forced me to get a little more familiar and intimate with the IO page than I had anticipated. I now feel I am like I potentially have not a PhD by any stretch, but potentially a master's degree in IO page setup.
How much help has Steve Genck been, and who else helped you on your Atmos setup journey type thing?
Well, first off, Steve has been a great mentor to me in my Atmos journey, and early on allowed me to come down to Los Angeles, stay at his house over the weekend, and get my own personal mix with the master's viewpoint of how this all works. He walked me through it step by step, and after a few hours, I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I know how this works. Makes total sense. Just to give kind of credit where credit's due, Steve certainly is one of the early adopters of Atmos. And another couple people I probably should name, Justin Gray in Toronto, also probably started around the same time as Steve, potentially even slightly earlier, to the point where Justin was bugging Kerry Thomas at Dolby when Kerry was working at Dolby. He was bugging him way early on, and everybody was like, "Whoa, slow your roll there, buddy. Just hang on. We're not quite there." So Justin was an early person, but also Stefan Bach and Morten Lindberg over in Europe definitely were early on the immersive thing. There's a lot of people. I know that there's people I know here in the Bay Area that were involved in 5.1 back in the day. So Atmos was just like the next logical step. But if we're just talking specifically Atmos, I tend to point to Steve Genck, Justin Gray, Morten Lindberg, and Stefan Bach as the four people that I'm aware of who really were early pioneers in Atmos.
So it's clearly now time to introduce Steve Genck, who has been a guest on our Studio Wrap Wednesday night Q&A. I started by asking Steve how he got started with all things Dolby Atmos.
What started me on the journey, I was I was dropped into the beginning of it, actually. So at the time, I was a staff engineer at Capitol, and I was called into a meeting by my bosses, and they said, "Look, here's the deal. We're gonna rip apart Studio C, our mix room, and we're gonna build a Dolby Atmos room, and then when that's done, you're gonna mix a record." And I said, "Okay, why are we going to do that?" And they said, "We're not really sure, but the record company's giving us a lot of money and they want us to do it. So that's what we're going to do." I said, "Okay, fine." Always up for a challenge. So we did that. I mean, it was a couple months, it took a month or so to redo the room. We had to, tear fabric out of walls and install a lot of speakers and ceiling speakers and side speakers. And at the time, they hadn't really done music only. Dolby Atmos was a movie format. It had been in movies for a few years at that point, so it wasn't new. The technology wasn't that new. It just hadn't been used for music only mixes. So at the time, it was actually a pretty big retrofit. We had to put in extra computers. We ended up with a 3-computer system. So there was suddenly MADI runs and Dante runs and all kinds of stuff like that, which we hadn't encountered before. So I had to learn about that stuff. So while they were installing, retrofitting the room, I was learning the software, which at the time was very film centric, so to speak. Was not did not have a music workflow, let's say. It kind of does now, but it's still basically a film, it's film software. So yeah, I just we finished the room, and the people from Dolby kind of went, "This is how you do it. This is object-based mixing." And then they gave me an REM record and said, "The band will be here in 2 weeks. Have a good time." And everybody left. And I was left to figure out how to mix a record in Dolby Atmos. Now, I wasn't completely, mixing in surround was not completely foreign to me. I mean, I had been through the 5.1 craze, I guess you could call it, in audio, in the early 2000s. So, I had worked with Elliot Shiner on a bunch of records, and Al Schmidt, and Jeff Emmerich and guys like that. So and we had I'd worked on a lot of films. So mixing in a surround format was not new to me. It was just how to get this new format to work. And I realized very quickly that this was kind of like 5.1, but this system actually worked. It worked really well. When I moved stuff, I could hear it, and I could, I could put stuff in the ceiling, and I could put stuff in the sides, and it actually stayed in the sides. And so it was actually really fun. And then they told me, it's a scalable system. So you can mix here at Capitol, and people will be able to hear it at the movie theater, and they'll be able to hear it on this system and that system. And it doesn't matter how many speakers you have and all that good stuff that we all know about now. And they said, and the great part is it's a calibrated system, and it's a full range system. I said, so I can put anything anywhere I want? And they were like, yeah. In the 5.1 days, we kind of, we were pretty tame about what we put in the back speakers because people had these, cheap 5.1 home theater systems. But they were like, no, you can put anything anywhere. And I said, okay, great. So I did. So I kind of went nuts with it. The first couple mixes, I had to dial it back a bit. And then, there's a long story about that first REM record and how we did it. And then it was, they would just said, okay, here's another song, mix this song now. Okay, here's another song, mix this song now. And unbeknownst to us at the time, there were deals in place with Amazon and Apple and all these companies, but we didn't know that at the time. At the time, I was being sent songs to mix. I had no idea why. I had no idea where they were going to be listened to. I had no idea who was going to listen to them. But I was told, yes, these will be released at some point. You're not making demos, so have fun. And we did that for years, kind of. It was really fun. There were like, at first it was me, and then, the other guys at Capitol came on board. So there were probably like 4 or 5 of us mixing. There were a couple outside guys but they were involved with us also. So there were literally like, outside of movie mixers, guys mixing music, there were like 5 of us for years. And we would just mix. It got to the point where I could kind of mix whatever I wanted. If I did a cool record, I'd be like, I'm gonna do an Atmos mix of this. And they'd be like, yeah, fine, go ahead. And then it was a lot of, well, we want, so-and-so artist on the label to hear this. So, here's a Sam Smith song, mix that, and then Sam's going to come and listen to it. Or here's a, whoever it was, here's a Coldplay song, not Coldplay, Bastille, mix some of their stuff. And, here's a U2 song, and then the band would come in and listen. So it was a lot of that kind of stuff too, trying to get bands and artists on board to, we'd like to mix some of your catalog. Here's what we can do with it. Here's 2 songs that Steve's mixed, and what do you think? And pretty much every artist, once we sat them down in the room and they heard it, loved it. The big question, and still to this day, is, well, how can people hear this? And at the time, my answer was, I have no idea. You have to know me, basically. But obviously there were, like I said, there were deals in place that we didn't know about. And then we knew about the deal. Then there was a deal with Amazon, and they said, okay, look, here's what's happening. Amazon's going to start releasing these things streaming. They have this new speaker. But we want to have a catalog of songs on the site when it goes live. And I think we needed 3,000 songs. So yeah, and at the time, we had a couple hundred, maybe, that 5 of us had done, So then it was all hands on deck, and there were 5 or 6 of us mixing nonstop for a couple months to hit that 3,000 song mark.
So do you think that clients at our level, and by that I don't mean U2 or Coldplay, although you did say that you mixed a Green Day track, are local and independent bands and artists asking for Atmos mixes? Do you hear that much, or do they even know what Atmos is?
I have to say, many more people's awareness of the artists that I work with, their awareness of Atmos is definitely much more prevalent. I guess that's what you would say. Their awareness is more there than it used to be. And when I present the option of, hey, I can mix this for you, but I can also give you an Atmos mix, it's just going to cost you a little bit more, but it's not going to cost you exponentially more. They're like, yeah. And then I always explain not just the mixing elements, but I think it's important to talk to the client about, what do I do with this after the fact? And what's important, I think, is helping people understand what the different digital aggregators like AvidPlay, DistroKid, Lander, how they take in and digest Atmos, what it costs, and where it shows up and where it doesn't show up. Amazon, Tidal, Apple Music, but also introducing the element of immersiveaudioalbum.com, where they can sell downloads to right now what's essentially an audiophile crowd, but they could sell downloads of Atmos mixes and 5.1 mixes to this crowd that is still paying for downloads at a rate of like, an average album price would be $20 to $24. So that presents more economic opportunity for the artist. So to me, it's good to hold their hand a little bit and just say, this is the path. Here's where you can make some money. Here's why this makes sense. And here's, how we can do this.